My name is David Hartful, and this is my critique of Rhetoric of Conflict and Compromise. Okay, so what we are going to start off doing here is I'm going to explain what the purpose of this is and what it's not. And I'm going to show you this slide on the next piece so that people can really understand what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. So the purpose of this critique is to better understand possible racial bias in spiral dynamics and the philosophy of Dr. Beck. By better understanding the shadow and the bias, we can then improve the philosophy and the community. Even if total change doesn't happen in spiral dynamics, it's good to go through these exercises so we can better refine our ideas on race. And at the end of this, we'll have a more inclusive community and a more reflective community. What this is not is accusing anybody of racism or accusing a philosophy of racism. It's just taking a hard look at how we look at race within the community and then deciding if anything in here is still continued on in the community or have we really moved past it or whatnot. So hopefully, at the end of this, we can have a better understanding of race in our community. Okay, so what was Rhetoric of Conflict and Compromise? It was Dr. Beck's PhD thesis on the American Civil War. And what he proposes is if people understood conflict better in the 1850s, we could have avoided the Civil War. So the data he's using from conflict, the understanding of conflict he uses, is from Sharif, Hovland, and Harvey. And they were very instrumental in conflict understanding and conflict resolution psychology in the 1960s. So it was written between 1964 and 1966 for the University of Oklahoma for a PhD. Another problem that I saw in the work was that it made the case that black people are too ego involved to think rationally on civil rights. Now, if you don't know what ego involved is, that just means that someone's so involved in something that they have to have a really hard stance on it. And so if you watch the first video in this series, it goes through detail what all these terms I'm going to be using will mean. So if you don't understand a term, go back and watch the first video. Okay, the problems I saw with Rhetoric. The main problem is the work overvalues compromise and undervalues the cost in human life in the natural function of slavery. So on the very first page it says, philosophers and statesmen across the Atlantic in 1860 to 1861 asked one another why 25 million intelligent Americans could not settle the condition of 4 million uneducated Africans without tearing one another's throats. So from that sentence alone, you're seeing that he's valuing the cost of white life in war above the cost of black life in the natural functioning of slavery. And it also presupposes that the planters would have freed their slaves based off a good philosophical argument. Now in reality, if you study the politics of 1850, it proves that there was no compromise on slavery, and that a ton of compromises were tried on slavery. Another problem was Dr. Beck never took a firm stance on what exactly should have been done instead. And that makes people question whether he really thought through the stance. Because if you look at what was going on in the 1850s, they tried everything they could try. So I think the conversation has to start on what exactly is slavery. So slavery was brutal because of its natural functioning. It wasn't brutal because of the moral failure of certain slave owners. One thing about living in like a very neoliberal society, we want to take everything back down to personal responsibility and personal morality. But we don't talk enough about the system within its natural functioning, how is it affecting people? And is the system in and of itself moral? We just assume that everybody can just transcend and be okay. And so when you apply that to slavery, you hear a lot of people talking about, oh, well, this slave owner was okay, or that slave owner was okay, or it wasn't as bad in Tennessee as it was in Alabama. So fundamentally, once a person has to work, but they can't get fired and they can't get a raise, the only way to motivate them to continue working is through violence. So as it's naturally functioning, you have to be violent to slaves. And also, slaves had no control of their own bodies. So you hear many stories about women and men being raped by slave masters. So I hear a lot of people coming back and saying that, well, low-paid factory work in the North was the same as slavery, because a low-paid factory worker would never have enough money to change his circumstances. And that's not true either. I mean, because one thing about factory workers is they actually had autonomy over their own body. So there's no stories of factory workers being pulled off the floor and forced into sex by the factory owner. That didn't happen. Also, slavery was so brutal, many people had to run, and then they had to make laws to have people captured and brought back. Now, that didn't happen with factory workers. If someone quit and moved out west, they quit and moved out west. They didn't have to have factory worker catchers to go grab people, drag them back, or kill them if they ran too many times. So factory work was nowhere near as brutal as slavery. Another thing that wasn't even mentioned in the book, that definitely should have been mentioned in the book, is the Dred Scott decision. So Dred Scott was a slave that lived with his master in Minnesota for 4 years. When they went back to Missouri, he's sued for his freedom because he said that he lived in Minnesota long enough to be considered a free man. Now, so he took it all the way to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court not only said he didn't have a right to sue his master, they also said a black man has no rights that a white man has to respect. So free or slave, white people didn't have to respect any of our rights. So on a less moral note, slavery of course depressed wages because nobody would ever get paid more than what it would cost to buy slave labor. And then on top of that, because even free quote-unquote labor was cheap, work from freemen was cheap, and then slavery, you had that, you didn't have any motivation to automate. So this idea that automation in the 1900s would have naturally ended slavery, there wouldn't have been a push to automate farm life, there wouldn't have been a push to automate factory work if people weren't getting paid enough to make it advantageous to get machines to make it easier. So, in summary, slavery was violent and self-perpetual. Another thing people don't understand is slavery would not have ended naturally. So, from 1820 to 1860, the cotton crop doubled every 10 years. A third of all Southerners were involved in slavery, either in ownership, overseeing, managing, selling, and buying slaves. So 1/3 of the South was involved in slavery in some way. The combined value of all slaves in the 1860s was $3.5 billion in 1860s money. So there was no way to borrow enough money to buy all the slaves and then free them. And that even presupposes every planter would be willing to free his slaves. Because after you've brutalized somebody, you can't just free them. So if you rape someone's wife, you can't just free the guy because he's going to want revenge. So even the idea of just buying all the slaves and freeing them, that assumes that the planter would be willing to do that. Another thing that's rarely talked about when talking about 1860s politics is the Southern filibuster. So the Southern filibusters were trying to spread slavery into Latin America. Now the most notorious group of filibusters were called the Knights of the Golden Circle. And so what they wanted to do was to build once the Southern states succeeded, would be create a new union with Latin America that would extend through Mexico, through Central America, up through the Caribbean and end in Florida. And that would be the Golden Circle. So the opening image from this video was a map of what the Golden Circle would have been. And so there were many attempts to move slavery into Latin America. One of the attempts, the most successful, was done by a Tennessean named William Walker, and he actually took over Nicaragua from 1856 to 1857 to make it an English-speaking slave colony. Another pro-slavery argument that was made was the fact that the slave population continued to grow. So if you confine slavery to the South, eventually they'll take up all the farmland in the South. The population would still grow. So you'd have an excess of idle slaves, and people were scared they would rebel. So you had to have a new land to put the excess population in. So the slavers wouldn't have just allowed themselves to be confined and let slavery implode on themselves. They would have fought to survive, because you can't have all these people there who want revenge. Like, you just can't do that. All right. So now we're going to talk about what it would take to compromise with slavers and what that really means. So the first attempt to compromise with slavers was the Compromise of 1850. So in this compromise, there's no slavery above the 3630 parallel except for Missouri. When a new state's added to the Union, there'll be one slave state and one free state to keep the balance of power. And so the Compromise of 1850, California is admitted, Texas is admitted, and the boundary of New Mexico is defined. And so that's how you start building those states up. Now, the reason the Compromise of 1850 didn't work was because of the Fugitive Slave Clause. So in the Constitution, there is a clause that says that slaves that run to a free state can be recaptured and brought back south. Now, what happened with that was white people would just go up to the north, capture black people, and drag them back down south. So to fight against that, many of the states in the North had personal liberty laws, which allowed for a trial by jury for black people. Northerners did not have to assist in capturing a slave. If you were a policeman up north or a sheriff, you didn't have to help anybody catch a slave. And then there was no state laws against if you tried to harbor slaves in your home and you're an abolitionist. So another part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act, and that abolished and superseded all those personal liberty laws. So at 1850, any black man living in the North could be abducted and drugged down south. So there was no free black people in 1850, in essence. Because you're not free if somebody can just come, accuse you of something, and drag you back down south. So, and then on top of that was the Dred Scott decision. Like I said before, that wasn't mentioned in the book at all, and it's crucial because that was the Supreme Court solidifying and bringing back and undergirding the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, saying that no black man has any right a white man has to respect. So there's no way for a black man to defend himself in the 1850s. So because of these laws, nobody could really sit on the sideline. Either you had to be complicit in slavery or you had to be against slavery. And all black people weren't free. There was no free black people back then. Because you're not free if someone can just accuse you of something and drag you back down south. So the South didn't like the Compromise of 1850 because they realized more states would be built or created above the 3630 parallel than below. And also it was looking like New Mexico would come in as a free state because many abolitionists sent people to New Mexico to ensure that when it becomes a state, it's free and you confine slavery, east of Texas. So they had to make another compromise, and that was the Popular Sovereignty Compromise of Stephen Douglas. So Stephen Douglas said that when state enters the Union, they can enter as a free or a slave state. So the next state up to bat was Kansas. So in Kansas, you had a lot of pro-slavery planters coming in, and they formed the first government in Lecompton, Kansas. And to retaliate, abolitionists came and created another government in Lawrence, Kansas. So then the two sides began fighting in Kansas on who would be in charge. And so the Lecompton Constitution was sent to Congress through many of the slave-owning Democrats. And a Democratic president who was friendly to slave owners was going to accept this into the Union. And the person that stopped it was Stephen Douglas, because he understood that most people living in Kansas were abolitionists and free soilers. So he knew that that Constitution didn't live up to the proper popular sovereignty principle. So the South didn't agree to comply with compromises it already agreed to. So looking at the other candidates in the 1860s, you got to look at John Bell. Now, John Bell was a slave owner himself, but he didn't want the slavery to expand to the West, because slavery is really only profitable in cotton, tobacco, and sugar. None of those things grow out west. So John Bell just pragmatically looked at it like it shouldn't expand out west. So he took no official stance on slavery in 1860 because he felt like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Dred Scott decision, Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution was enough undergirding for slavery that you didn't need anything else. And he also wasn't originally up for secession. He didn't agree with that. So he only wins 3 border states. So he wasn't. His stance wasn't popular, even though it was ultimately a pro-slavery stance. And Bell ends up having to join the Confederacy because he's from Tennessee, and Tennessee succeeds. So another thing that's not talked about enough in the book is the amount of moderation Abraham Lincoln actually showed. So first off, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He never joined an abolitionist organization. And Don Beck does put him as a moral political moderate and not a moral radical. So he didn't want slavery to spread out west, which was the most moderate Republican position at that time. And after the state started succeeding and he gets inaugurated, he actually supports the Corn Amendment to undergird slavery to bring them back. And they wouldn't do that. So the South was the one not willing to compromise. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. So, and South Carolina succeeded as soon as he was elected. And 5 other southern states succeed before he's even inaugurated. So, now the last person I want to talk about is John Breckinridge, who broke with Douglas over popular sovereignty. So he wasn't a believer in democracy. Because if you believed in democracy, popular sovereignty would be an acceptable thing for you to compromise on. So he wanted to expand the U.S. into Cuba, which was part of his party platform. He thought Cuba would come in as a slave state and build more power for the slaveholders. He wanted a national slave code to further undergird Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and make it even easier for people to go retrieve their slaves. And another part of his political philosophy was he was a secessionist. He was pro-secession back in 1820, and he saw the Constitution as simply an agreement, and when any state feels it's no longer advantageous, they could just leave. So to summarize what it means to compromise with slavers is, any compromise with slavers is going to end up becoming something that's unethical, because slaves are suffering as you're prolonging the institution, even if you find ways to make it easier. So the South routinely uses violence to keep control and suppress dissenters. And on my earlier video, I talked about how they reduce free speech to keep abolitionists out. The North did offer many compromises, and none of the southern states accepted it, and they also succeeded. So there was no way to compromise with slavery, and the book doesn't make a firm stance on what else should have been done. So now I'm going to talk about other problematic views in rhetoric. The analysis of black people's views on segregation. So there was a study done in the book where black people were asked their views on other black people and segregation. So he doesn't go into detail what these views were, but I'm assuming they were negative views on black people, or they were pro-segregationist views. So the study showed that black men, or black people in general, had a smaller latitude of acceptance for slavery, for segregation and Jim Crow than white people did. And so from there it was concluded that black people think less rationally on the issue of civil rights. So what wasn't asked in the book was, would it be psychologically healthy for a black man to harbor pro-segregationist views? Because segregation is based off the idea that black people are inferior. So even if you feel like you are intelligent as an individual, if you feel like you're from an inferior group in general, is that a psychologically healthy thing to believe? And wouldn't that be pathological just in and of itself? Another thing they should have done was ask white people things that they would be sensitive about. It would have been interesting to see what they would have said if they were asked how they would feel if their daughter married a black man, and then asked a bunch of black people how they would feel if their daughter married a white guy. I assume, and I have good evidence from personal experience, that the white guys would be have a lot lower latitude of acceptance for that than the black men would. So from there I could just conclude that all white people are irrational when they talk about interracial dating. I should just dismiss anything a white person has to say. So, and this has implications in 1966. So this is a master's thesis from the University of Oklahoma. So this is something that you can take as a PhD thesis from the University of Oklahoma. This is something that you can take as scientific facts. So if you read this in 1966, you would have a scientific justification to dismiss the views of black people at the height of the civil rights movement. So, I mean, this isn't a benign thing. It's also on Amazon as an ebook. So someone had to have gone back and put it back out there as an ebook. So those with low education were also criticized in the book. In the Civil War section, he talked about common people who were uneducated weren't looking at the slavery issue in a complex enough manner, and they were brought in by pomp and circumstance. And I'll have a study to back this up, but I would assume that, or from my personal experience at least, I would say that people with less education focus less on ethereal ideas and more on how an idea plays out on the ground. And they're also less likely to hide their shadow. So I think having people of all education levels in a conversation is good, because oftentimes people with less education can strip ideas down to how they actually will play out in the field and not get caught up in just ideals and things like that. So I don't have a study to back that up yet. I'll keep looking into this and see if I can find something to back that up. So ultimately, why does all this matter? So the reason why understanding slavery is important is because 20% of Trump supporters, according to a New York Times poll, believe freeing slaves was a bad idea. So there's a lot of pro-slavery people even today. And understanding slavery should undergird your social justice philosophy. Because once you really understand what happened during slavery, you understand why there needs to be mental, spiritual, and material healing done to help African Americans. You also understand how the African American struggle is different from the immigrant struggle and the LGBT struggle. So once you understand all that, you can understand why there needs to be specific action done to address the needs of descendants of slaves. So that's all I have for right now. I have a link to buy the book below, so read the book yourself, see if I got anything right. If you comment on this, I really want you to make sure you've actually read the book before you comment, because if you haven't read the book, I'm not going to sit and argue with you on this. So thank you for your time. I almost forgot. There is a clip from an NPR segment at the end of this video I want you to read. It was written by a historian who studied the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And from there, he had a very interesting conclusion once he had written his book and done all his work. I want you to listen to that too.
Let's get back to my interview with historian Andrew Delbanco, author of The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. When we left off, we were talking about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed slave catchers to abduct freed or escaped slaves and return them to the South. So Congress repealed the fugitive slave law in June of 1864. Congress by that time was the North. There wasn't a Southern vote to object to the repeal. Right. And then the war ended about a year later. So let's jump ahead. I mean, you're a professor of American Studies, so you don't just study the Civil War or the history of slavery. You're looking at the history of our country. Right. And a lot of people have written about this and spoken about this, but for you, how do you see the long-standing consequences of slavery for African Americans in the United States?
Well, let me try it this way. We often speak these days about people of color or minorities, and there are good reasons to group people into those categories under certain circumstances. But I don't think we want to obscure the fact that there's one group of Americans who immigrated here involuntarily and who were treated for almost 250 years as a species of animate property, no different from a horse or a cow. Now, yeah, it's been a long time since the Civil War. It's been a long time since the amendments following the Civil War guaranteed citizenship to former slaves, attempted to guarantee the right to vote to former slaves. But in the long arc of history, 150 years, give or take a few, is not a very long time for people who have been subjected to that kind of not just physical but psychological and moral brutality to just sort of shake it off and say, well, you know, here I am and no problem. That's not the way history works. We could cite many other milestones in our history in the 150 years since to suggest that black people haven't exactly been invited to participate in American society with full equality any time that I can remember. I do believe it's wrong to tell the American story without acknowledging the progress that has been made in this country, and I have a certain faith in younger people that old, deep-seated racial attitudes don't make much sense to a lot of the young people I know, and I'm not just talking about New York City, but I get around the country a certain amount. And yet to pretend that black people are not still dealing with the legacy of slavery is preposterous.
This is a question I know you can't answer.